The final test of life is not success, suffering, or recognition, but consciousness. Most people believe life is measured by milestones, achievements, or the ability to endure pain. They assume that surviving hardship or accumulating status proves worth. Yet these are only surface evaluations. Consciousness, by contrast, is an inner measure. It asks not what happened to you, but whether you were awake while it happened. Consciousness means seeing reality as it is, not as the ego wishes it to be. It requires the courage to observe your thoughts, impulses, and reactions without immediately identifying with them. A person may achieve great success and still fail this test if their life is driven by unconscious fear, approval-seeking, or imitation. Another may suffer deeply and still fail if pain becomes an identity rather than a teacher. Awareness, not circumstance, determines whether the test is passed. Most people live reactively. They are pulled by emotions they do not understand, and by patterns formed long before they had a choice. They call these habits personality, fate, or luck, unaware that much of their behavior is automatic. Consciousness begins the moment you recognize that your reactions are not commands. Anger, jealousy, shame, and fear can be observed rather than obeyed. This observation creates distance, and in that distance, freedom begins. The final test confronts you with yourself when no external structure tells you who to be. Titles fall away, applause fades, relationships change. In these moments, unconscious individuals feel lost, empty, or resentful. They seek distraction or attach themselves to new identities. Conscious individuals, however, use these moments as mirrors. They ask what remains when the roles dissolve. They notice the patterns that surface in silence. They learn from what disturbs them instead of running from it. To become conscious is to accept responsibility for your inner world. This does not mean self-blame, it means self-honesty. You stop attributing all your suffering to the outside and begin examining your expectations, projections, and unresolved conflicts. You see how often you give others power over your emotion. You realize how much energy is spent defending an image rather than living truthfully. Awareness replaces accusation. One of the hardest aspects of this test is facing the shadow, the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. These parts do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They influence choices from the background, shaping relationships and decisions. Consciousness requires the humility to admit that darkness exists within you, not as a moral failure, but as human reality. When these aspects are acknowledged, they lose their destructive force and become sources of insight. Suffering plays a critical role in this process. Pain often interrupts unconscious living. It breaks routines and exposes illusions. But suffering alone does not lead to growth. Many people suffer for years without becoming aware. Consciousness arises when pain is reflected upon rather than merely endured. When you ask not only why something hurts, but what it reveals about you. Attachments, fears, and beliefs. Suffering becomes transformative. Recognition and validation can be even more dangerous than suffering. Praise strengthens the ego's illusion. It can trap a person in a persona that must be maintained at all costs. Consciousness demands the ability to stand without external confirmation. It asks whether you know who you are when no one is watching, when approval is absent, and when being authentic risks misunderstanding or rejection. Passing the final test does not mean perfection or constant peace. It means you are no longer asleep to your own life. You notice when old patterns return. You catch yourself before self-deception hardens. You live with an ongoing dialogue between awareness and instinct. Life becomes less about control and more about clarity. You stop demanding that reality conform to your expectations and begin engaging with it honestly. The ultimate measure of a life is not how impressive it appeared from the outside, but how deeply it was lived from within. Consciousness transforms ordinary moments into meaningful experiences. It allows you to respond rather than react, to choose rather than repeat, to live deliberately instead of mechanically. When this awareness is present, even uncertainty becomes bearable, because you are no longer lost within it. What feels like isolation is often initiation into a deeper self. Most people experience isolation as a failure, a sign that something has gone wrong in their life or personality. They assume that being alone means being unwanted, disconnected, or lacking value. Yet isolation frequently arrives not as punishment, but as a threshold. It appears when the old ways of relating to the world no longer fit, and the new ways have not yet fully formed. Isolation begins when familiar connections lose their meaning. Conversations that once felt engaging now seem repetitive or shallow. Social environments that once provided comfort start to feel draining. This shift can be deeply unsettling because humans are conditioned to measure belonging through external validation. When that validation weakens, the ego interprets it as danger. In reality, it is often a sign of inner development demanding space. Initiation has always required separation. In ancient traditions, those undergoing transformation were removed from their community and placed in solitude. The purpose was not abandonment, but confrontation. Without distraction, the individual was forced to meet their own thoughts, fears, memories, and desires directly. Modern isolation functions in a similar way, though without ceremony or explanation. Life quietly removes noise so something essential can be heard. During isolation, the mind becomes louder. Unresolved emotions surface. Old wounds reopen. Doubts emerge about identity and direction. This is why many people rush to escape solitude as quickly as possible. They fill their time with constant stimulation, relationships, or work, hoping to drown out discomfort. But what feels unbearable is often the very material needed for growth. The psyche uses isolation to bring unconscious content into awareness. A deeper self cannot emerge in constant reaction to others. When identity is shaped primarily by approval, comparison, or expectation, it remains fragile. Isolation strips these external references away. You begin to notice how much of your behavior was performative rather than authentic. You see which desires are truly yours and which were adopted to belong. This process can feel like disorientation because the old self is dissolving before the new one has taken form. Loneliness and isolation are not the same. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection without understanding. Isolation becomes initiation when there is reflection rather than resistance. When you stop asking, what is wrong with me? And start asking, what is this period asking of me? The experience changes. Solitude becomes a laboratory rather than a prison. In isolation, patterns become visible. You notice recurring thoughts that once went unquestioned. You see emotional reactions that no longer make sense. This awareness is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Without constant external influence, responsibility turns inward. You recognize how often you abandon yourself to be accepted. You see the cost of avoiding conflict, truth, vulnerability. These realizations are not meant to shame you, but to mature you. Isolation also reveals strength that was previously untested. When you learn to regulate your emotions without immediate reassurance, resilience develops. When you sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to resolve it, patience grows. You discover that your inner world is capable of holding complexity, contradiction, and silence. This capacity is essential for depth, wisdom, and genuine connection later on. Many people misunderstand this phase and attempt to return to old versions of themselves. They reconnect with environments that no longer align, hoping familiarity will restore comfort. But initiation cannot be reversed. Once awareness expands, regression feels hollow. The discomfort of isolation persists until the inner shift is honored. Growth demands cooperation. The deeper self that forms in isolation is not louder or more impressive. It is quieter, more grounded, and less dependent on external affirmation. Values become internal rather than negotiated. Choices are guided by alignment instead of fear. This self does not seek constant visibility, yet it possesses a stronger presence. It knows when to engage and when to withdraw. Isolation also refines perception. You become more sensitive to energy, intention, and authenticity. Superficial interactions stand out clearly, while meaningful ones become rare but profound. This discernment is not judgment, it is clarity. You no longer crave connection at any cost. You prefer depth over quantity, truth over comfort. What feels like isolation is often life preparing you for a different way of being. It clears space for integration, understanding, and self-trust. The world does not disappear during this time. It simply steps back. And in that space, something essential reorganizes itself, teaching you how to stand alone without feeling empty, how to belong to yourself before belonging anywhere else. The mind stops seeking approval. When the soul learns self-authority, for most of life, approval functions as an invisible currency. From an early age, acceptance becomes linked to survival, and the mind learns to scan the environment for cues about how to behave, what to suppress, and what to display. This pattern is so deeply ingrained that it often goes unnoticed. People call it being polite, adaptable, or realistic without realizing how much of their inner life is shaped by the fear of disapproval. Approval seeking is not a flaw of character, it is a strategy. It develops when external validation replaces internal guidance. The mind learns that safety lies in being liked, praised, or at least not rejected. Over time, this creates a fragmented self. Thoughts are filtered before being expressed. Desires are questioned before being pursued. Authentic impulses are delayed or abandoned if they threaten acceptance. The cost of this strategy is subtle but immense. Self-authority begins when attention turns inward. Instead of asking how one is perceived, the individual starts asking whether their actions are aligned with their values. This shift is not loud or dramatic. It often begins quietly, through exhaustion. The constant monitoring of others' reactions becomes draining. The effort to maintain an image becomes unsustainable. At this point, the soul demands a different way of living. The soul, unlike the mind, is not interested in approval. It is oriented toward truth, coherence, and meaning. When self-authority emerges, decisions are no longer outsourced to consensus or comparison. Guidance comes from an internal sense of rightness rather than external reward. This does not mean rebellion or disregard for others. It means that integrity becomes non-negotiable. The transition from approval seeking to self-authority is uncomfortable. The mind resists because it equates approval with safety. When external validation decreases, anxiety often increases at first. Old fears surface, fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or alone. This phase tests commitment to inner truth. Many retreat at this point, returning to familiar patterns because discomfort feels like danger. Self-authority develops through action, not affirmation. Each time a person chooses honesty over acceptance, strength increases. Each time boundaries are set without justification, self-trust grows. The soul learns that it can survive disapproval. The mind gradually recalibrates, realizing that external reactions are information, not verdicts. As self-authority deepens, relationships change. Some connections weaken because they were sustained by compliance rather than authenticity. Others strengthen because they are rooted in mutual respect rather than mutual need. The individual becomes less reactive, less eager to explain or defend. Silence replaces over-explanation. Presence replaces performance. The mind stops seeking approval, not because it no longer cares, but because it no longer needs. There is a profound difference. Compassion remains, but dependency dissolves. Criticism loses its power to destabilize. Praise no longer defines worth. Emotional balance becomes less dependent on circumstances and more anchored in self-knowledge. This shift also alters ambition. Goals are no longer pursued to prove value but to express it. Success becomes a byproduct of alignment rather than a measure of identity. Failure becomes instructive rather than humiliating. When self-authority is present, learning replaces self-punishment. One of the clearest signs of self-authority is the ability to disappoint others without betraying oneself. This capacity requires maturity and emotional resilience. It involves tolerating misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. It means allowing others to have their reactions while remaining rooted in your own truth. The mind, once obsessed with approval, becomes a tool rather than a master. It still evaluates, plans, and adapts, but it no longer dictates worth. The soul leads, setting direction through values and intuition. This internal hierarchy restores coherence. Inner conflict decreases because decisions arise from a unified center rather than competing fears. Self-authority does not isolate, it clarifies. It attracts relationships and opportunities that resonate with authenticity rather than conformity. Life becomes less about managing impressions and more about living deliberately. When approval is no longer the goal, freedom emerges not as recklessness, but as quiet confidence grounded. In self-respect, pain becomes purposeful when it is understood rather than resisted. Most people instinctively treat pain as an enemy, something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Emotional discomfort, psychological tension, and inner conflict are seen as obstacles to happiness rather than messages to be interpreted. This reflex to resist is understandable, but it often prolongs suffering instead of resolving it. Pain that is ignored, suppressed, or avoided does not disappear. It waits, accumulating force beneath awareness. Resistance to pain usually takes subtle forms. Distraction, rationalization, blame, and numbness are common strategies. People stay busy to avoid feeling, intellectualize emotions to avoid experience them, or project their discomfort onto others to escape responsibility. These strategies offer temporary relief, but they prevent insight. Without understanding, pain remains chaotic and overwhelming. Understanding pain requires presence. It asks for attention rather than escape. When pain is observed without immediate judgment, its nature begins to change. What once felt like a single overwhelming sensation reveals layers: fear, grief, unmet needs, violated boundaries, or unresolved loss. This differentiation transforms pain from an amorphous threat into meaningful information. Purpose emerges when pain is allowed to speak. Emotional pain often signals misalignment between values and actions, needs and circumstances, truth and behavior. Anxiety may point to internal conflict. Anger may indicate a boundary crossed. Sadness may reflect attachment to something that has ended. When these signals are interpreted, pain shifts from punishment to guidance. Understanding does not mean indulging pain or becoming attached to it. It means relating to it consciously. This requires patience because insight does not arrive instantly. The mind wants quick resolution, but the psyche unfolds at its own pace. Sitting with discomfort long enough to understand it demands courage. Many would rather repeat familiar suffering than face unfamiliar truth. Resistance often intensifies pain. When an experience is labeled unacceptable, the body and mind tighten. This tension amplifies distress. Understanding, by contrast, creates space. Even before circumstances change, the inner relationship to pain softens. Acceptance does not remove difficulty, but it reduces unnecessary struggle. Pain is still present, but it is no longer overwhelming. One of the reasons pain feels meaningless is because it is often experienced in isolation. People are taught to hide vulnerability, to appear composed, to move on quickly. This isolation prevents reflection. When pain is acknowledged internally, it becomes part of a larger narrative. It is seen as a chapter rather than a verdict. Purposeful pain contributes to psychological maturity. It refines perception and deepens empathy. Those who have examined their own suffering are less likely to dismiss the suffering of others. They recognize complexity instead of simplifying experiences into right and wrong. This depth is not acquired through comfort, but through conscious engagement with difficulty. Understanding pain also reveals patterns. Repeated emotional wounds often point to recurring choices, beliefs, or relational dynamics. Without reflection, these patterns repeat endlessly. When pain is understood, cycles can be interrupted. Awareness introduces choice where compulsion once ruled. This is one of the most transformative aspects of conscious suffering. Pain becomes especially destructive when it is personalized as proof of inadequacy. Many people interpret suffering as evidence that something is wrong with them. This belief adds shame to pain, doubling its weight. Understanding reframes pain as an experience rather than an identity. You are not your suffering, you are the one who can learn from it. There's also a temporal dimension to purposeful pain. Immediate understanding is not always possible. Some experiences only reveal their meaning later, when distance allows perspective. What matters is the willingness to eventually reflect rather than permanently resist. This openness keeps pain from hardening into bitterness. When pain is understood, it integrates into the self rather than fragmenting it. The experience becomes part of personal wisdom. It informs decisions, shapes boundaries, and clarifies priorities. Life becomes more coherent because suffering has contributed to awareness rather than confusion. Purpose does not mean that pain was necessary or deserved. It means that it was not wasted. Understanding transforms pain from a force that diminishes life into one that deepens it. In this way, pain becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor, guiding the individual toward greater honesty, resilience, and self-knowledge. Passing the final test means no longer abandoning yourself to belong. Expand it in 700 words and never add any ending. Sentence: passing the final test means no longer abandoning yourself to belong. From early life, belonging is treated as survival. Acceptance by family, peers, and society becomes tied to safety, love, and identity. To secure this belonging, people learn to adjust themselves, softening opinions, pressing emotions, reshaping desires. Over time, these adjustments become habits, and eventually they feel like personality. The cost of belonging is rarely questioned until the inner tension becomes impossible to ignore. Self-abandonment often appears subtle and reasonable. It shows up as staying silent to avoid conflict, agreeing when something feels wrong, or choosing paths that earn approval rather than meaning. These behaviors are rewarded socially, which reinforces them. Yet each small compromise creates distance from the inner self. The individual remains connected to others, but disconnected from their own truth. The final test emerges when this disconnection becomes visible. It usually arrives during periods of transition loss, failure, solitude, or deep reflection. In these moments, external validation weakens, and the familiar sources of belonging no longer provide reassurance. The question surfaces quietly but persistently: who are you when you stop performing for acceptance? Many people respond to this question by doubling down on conformity. They seek new groups, identities, or roles that promise belonging without requiring self-examination. Others grow bitter, blaming the world for their dissatisfaction. Passing the test requires a different response. It requires the willingness to risk being misunderstood in order to remain honest. No longer abandoning yourself does not mean rejecting connection. It means redefining it. Belonging is no longer achieved through self-erasure, but through self-presence. Relationships formed this way are fewer but more genuine. They are based on mutual recognition rather than mutual need. This shift can feel lonely at first, because it disrupts familiar patterns. The comfort of fitting in is replaced by the challenge of standing alone. Fear plays a central role in self-abandonment. Fear of rejection, judgment, and isolation drives people to silence themselves. When this fear is examined rather than obeyed, it loses authority. The individual learns that discomfort does not equal danger. Disapproval becomes tolerable. Silence from others no longer feels like annihilation. This resilience marks a significant psychological transition. Passing the final test involves reclaiming responsibility for one's inner life. Instead of asking how to be accepted, the focus shifts to how to live truthfully. This does not guarantee external approval. In fact, it often reduces it, but it increases coherence. The inner and outer self align. Energy previously spent on self-monitoring becomes available for creativity, depth, and presence. There is grief in this process. Letting go of conditional belonging means acknowledging how often love was tied to performance. It means recognizing that some relationships were sustained by compliance rather than connection. This realization can be painful, but it is also liberating. It clears space for a different kind of intimacy, one that does not require constant self-negotiation. As self-abandonment ends, boundaries strengthen. Saying no becomes possible without guilt. Saying yes becomes meaningful rather than automatic. The individual becomes less reactive because decisions are guided internally rather than by external pressure. Life begins to feel less fragmented, as choices are no longer made to satisfy competing expectations. Passing the final test does not lead to isolation as an end state. It leads to a more grounded form of belonging. When you belong to yourself, you carry stability into every interaction. You are less likely to lose yourself in relationships or roles. Others may sense this steadiness and respond with respect, or they may withdraw if they relied on your self-erasure. The final test is not dramatic or public. It unfolds quietly in everyday moments, when truth is easier to hide, when approval is easier to chase, when silence feels safer than honesty. Each choice to remain present with yourself strengthens self-trust. Over time, belonging shifts from something you seek to something you embody, rooted not in adaptation but in integrity.